Any White House press secretary has to be adept at dealing with crises. That comes with the job. But what happens when the crisis concerns multiple, coordinated attacks that strike at the heart of the country's national security and finance centers? Well, today I'm joined by Ari Fleischer, former White House press secretary to George W. Bush. Sir, thank you so much for being with us today. And I want to begin by going through the events of that morning. You're in Sarasota, Florida for an education event. When did you first realize that America was under attack?
Well, when I got out of the motorcade at the little elementary school in Sarasota, I got a page telling me that the World Trade Center had been hit by an airplane. And like everybody in America at that moment, I assumed this has to be some type of terrible accident. But then a few moments later, I was in that schoolroom in Florida, about 15 feet over the left of President Bush's shoulder, and I got a second page. And the second page said that the second tower of the World Trade Center had been hit, and I knew instantly it had to be terrorism.
Now, you actually went behind the press corps and signaled to the president. You held up a sign. What did that sign say, and what were you trying to communicate to the president at that moment?
Well, the plan was, because the president already knew about the World Trade Center being hit, that New York was going to need help no matter what. This was obviously a big fire, and federal resources were going to be made available to New York City. And so the president was going to make that announcement in that schoolroom to the press pool. Once I got that second page, I walked over, put my back to the press, and held up a note that said, "Don't say anything yet." Because clearly, with this being terrorism and this being an attack on the country, I didn't think it'd be wise for the president to address the country until he was armed with more facts, armed with more information. And he gave me a little one of those nods like that, and then left the schoolroom a few minutes later.
Now, you leave the school, you get on Air Force One. What were some of the challenges of getting and communicating information?
Once we boarded Air Force One, we knew 3 aircraft had gone down because on the way to the Air Force One, we heard about the plane that hit the Pentagon. As soon as we boarded, we heard there were 6 aircraft that had not responded to the order to land. And so the thinking was there's still 6 missiles in the sky. Then we heard a little bit later that morning about the plane that went down in Pennsylvania. So now we thought there are still 5 missiles in the sky. So there was still a lot of information, a lot of threats out there that, in this case, didn't all turn out to be real, but nobody knew that at that time.
Now, we hear the term fog of war, and we've kind of seen some of this. For instance, when President Barack Obama announced that Osama bin Laden had been killed, there was a lot of misinformation out there. As a communications person, how do you strike a balance between providing accurate information in a timely manner versus protecting national security interests?
Well, it's a vital issue for the government at all times to decide how much do you share, when do you share it. And in a case like September 11th, there was just so much out there that the media was reporting that turned out to be wrong. For example, the media reported that there was a car bomb at the State Department, that the mall was on fire. Those turned out to be incorrect reports. There was information that came in on Air Force One that said Angel is next, meaning Air Force One, using the code word, is next. There was information that said there's a threat to the president's ranch. Well, a lot of that information turned out to be wrong as well. It's always hard to know, what do you report, when do you report it, how much should you hold back? If you hold something back that later turns out to be true, you'll be accused of withholding information that the public was entitled to know. So at all times, these are very difficult calls for anybody in the government to make. The judgment we had on September 11th was anything that we knew to be true, we were reporting out to be true. If there was information that was sheer speculation, such as the attack on the president's ranch, which intelligence had picked up, we didn't report that out. We didn't know if it was true or not true.
There's never really a playbook to deal with an event like September 11th. After you've reflected over this day for the past 10 years, what are some of the things that you've maybe learned looking back?
Well, I think the most important lesson of September 11th is America is and will always be somewhat vulnerable. There are still people who would try to attack us if they could. And since September 11th, we've been fortunate that no major attacks have taken place. There was, of course, the Times Square bomber but for the grace of God, his bomb didn't go off. And so we are still a nation that is threatened. And it's a reminder of how grateful we should be for the military that's out there every day fighting so we can be safe and free within our borders and elsewhere. But we just have to check our instincts as a country and say that we're in for a struggle. And we are in for somewhat of a long struggle. And it's been a successful one so far, carried out, I must say, by 2 presidents who have done a good job protecting this country. President Obama has kept up many of the George Bush policies, such as, I'm proud to say, leaving Guantanamo open now, indefinite detention, warrantless wiretaps, the predator strikes in Pakistan, which President Obama has increased. These are the aggressive steps the nation has to take to keep us safe. And I'm glad now that it's achieved bipartisan support, because this is the shape of the battlefield we face today.
Now, getting back to that day, President Bush had come in. He was very focused on domestic policy. He was not expecting to be a wartime president. What change did you witness in him as the events unfolded?
Well, I think the big change that I saw in George Bush was just the isolated focus, almost isolated focus on protecting America. He knew at that point that this was going to be a presidency that was defined by national security. And I think that largely stayed right up through almost the end of his term and until the financial crisis of 2008. But what I also saw in George W. Bush was a man of steely determination and strong conviction, stayed a man of strong conviction. He knew his job was to protect this country. He did some things that he was later criticized for, things that now President Obama has continued to do, despite criticizing President Bush for doing them. But George Bush did them because he thought it was in the best interest of this country to keep people safe. This is why Guantanamo was opened in the first place. This is why we have indefinite detention as a policy, a bipartisan policy for this country. This is why we have military commissions. George Bush did not change when it came to protecting this country and keeping us strong and acting on conviction. And I was always proud to see that.
Now, you had the difficult job of going out there every day, informing the public of what was going on. But when did you personally start to feel the magnitude of the events?
Well, right away on September 11th, it was almost as if something just kicked in and you just had to do your job. That was all you could focus on when you're in the government at a time like that. And my job was to take that podium, brief the press, and hopefully lend a sense of calm to the nation. On a personal level, it wasn't until after September 11th, almost a week later during one of the Jewish holidays, I was on the phone with a cousin of mine whose office was in New York City, and she told me how she saw one of the airplanes hit the World Trade Center. And I'm from New York City. That's where I was born. I was raised in Westchester County. And it was at that moment that, for me, at least on a personal level, I for the first time broke down and cried. The only time I broke down and cried. And that's where I allowed myself to no longer be the White House press secretary, just to be a New Yorker and to think about everything that happened, the lives that were lost, and the calamity that my hometown was going through. I was at home, and I just remember I just lost it. I broke down and cried on the phone with my cousin. And then I went back to work the next day and didn't tell anybody anything and just did my job.
Now, many people were grieving right alongside with you. And,
That's right.
you know, we look at these attacks, and they occurred before we had Twitter. We didn't have Facebook. Given today's social media environment, how do you feel these tools help or hinder crisis communications?
Well, you can't stop technology. One way or another, technology is going to keep on proceeding, and everybody just has to react to it. In many ways, it's easier that we didn't have social media in 2001 because all kinds of other rumors and incorrect information, I'm sure, would have swirled out there. You know, it was a lot of the TV stations were reporting about the car bomb at the State Department or the mall being on fire, which were incorrect. Who knows what else would have been wrong in social media. On the other hand, many family members might have gotten a sacred last message from their loved ones off of Facebook or off of Twitter. Perhaps people on the airlines, on the aircraft, would have been able to get messages out before they lost their lives in Pennsylvania. That probably would have been very meaningful to the recipients of those messages. And who knows what would have been tweeted or put on YouTube from inside the burning World Trade Center. These are harrowing thoughts in some ways also about what modern technology means when communications is so instant at a time of death and at a time of destruction. But you can't stop technology. It's part of how we all communicate. And I just will hope and pray that none of that has to get put to use in the United States, at least, or anywhere around the world, but in the United States, in case there's another attack.
Like you said, sir, technology may change, but human character never does. When you look back at the events and 10 years later, what is the one thing that you hope this administration that you were part of will be remembered in dealing with these terrible attacks?
I hope that when people look back on these attacks, people will say, George Bush helped keep us safe. that this government, that this administration did what needed to be done so we were not attacked again, and that George Bush also left in place a national security apparatus that President Obama has largely continued, that have continued to keep us safe, and also a mindset that we'll go on the offensive against terrorists. We won't just sit back and defend. We'll go on the offensive and disrupt them before they can ever regroup to attack us.
Well, sir, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an honor speaking with you.
My pleasure.
And that was Ari Fleischer, former White House press secretary to George W. Bush. He now heads a sports consulting firm, Fleischer Communications. For PJTV, I'm Alexis Garcia.